Good evening. About 7 years ago, I traveled to a remote town in Chihuahua because my grandmother Marina was sick, and at that time I was the only one in the family who could take care of her. Or rather, the only one who wanted to, since the rest of the family had quite a few prejudices against her. I wasn't very close to her either. I had seen her as a child a few times, at funerals, at Christmas, and she always left me with the same impression that she was a hard woman who didn't show her feelings, or maybe didn't feel them at all. But despite that distance between us, it weighed on my conscience not to be there to help her. When I arrived at her house, I was surprised to see her so normal and so strong. She was thin, yes, and walked more slowly, but she still had that heavy gaze and firm tone she always used to ask for things. The house also looked normal, a bit old but quite clean and quiet, with saints on the walls and a smell of dried herbs that never went away. What I did remember as soon as I crossed the door was something my mother always said about her, that she was a dangerous witch and that it was better not to get too involved in her matters or question her. I am Catholic, not a fanatic, but I do believe, and to be honest, it made me a bit uncomfortable to see the irony of her having saints and crosses hanging everywhere, while at the same time having a cabinet full of dried herbs, candles, and ingredients that she obviously used in her rituals. Still, I resigned myself, since she was still the same withdrawn woman as always. But at least she thanked me for being there and helping her while she recovered from the back pain she had, a small injury that kept her from lifting weight. The first week passed without anything strange. I helped her carry anything heavy she needed, and I cooked for her so she wouldn't have to spend too much time standing. As I said, my grandmother Marina was not the most affectionate person in the world, but at least she showed she was grateful for my presence. Living in a somewhat isolated town, I was also in charge of going to the nearby town to do the shopping so she wouldn't lack anything and all that. Sometimes she woke up in a bad mood and wouldn't even speak to me, but in general it was a fairly calm week. But one afternoon something changed. The first thing was that a girl knocked on the door around 5 in the afternoon and asked directly for Marina. They talked for 2 hours until the girl left. Then around 11, my grandmother Marina knocked on the door of the room where I was sleeping and told me to get ready because I had to accompany her to buy some things. I was surprised that she wanted to go out at that hour and asked her where we were going while I helped her get into the truck. As was typical of her, she told me to just drive and that she would tell me where to go. We drove for a while along an empty road that left the town, and she guided me as if she knew the way by heart. After a while, we were on a narrower dirt road. I was about to ask her if she was sure where we were going when I saw some lights ahead. We arrived at a flat area where there was a small market with an improvised appearance. There were no more than 15 stalls, all covered with dark tarps, as if they had been set up there only for that night. And even though it was late, there were still people buying and selling, all very low profile. I turned off the truck and looked at her to ask what we were doing there. She looked at me with that annoyed face she gave me since I was a child, when I asked too many questions, and told me that this was the Black Rooster Fair and that she was going to buy some things. She didn't tell me to follow her, but I went with her because I wasn't going to leave her alone. And from the moment I stepped there, I felt that the place was very strange. Not because people looked aggressive or anything like that. On the contrary, it was too quiet. Almost no one spoke. They just walked, bought, and kept going. At the stalls, they sold syrups, plants, candles, jars with thick liquids, and something very important: small bones and dried animal parts. Things that looked like ears or hands of animals. And although I didn't want to look too much, there were also cages full of animals: cats, black roosters, rabbits, birds, and even small goats. I asked my grandmother what that place was, and where so many people came from, because on the way we hadn't seen a single house, but she didn't give details and only told me not to touch anything and not to look too much. Marina bought several things: 2 jars, some tied branches, and a small black cloth bag that I didn't know what it contained. She also stared for a while at a black rooster, but in the end she didn't take it. On the way back home, we barely spoke, and when we were already close to the town, she took out a bundle of branches and put it on my legs and told me to place that next to my bed, and that if I saw or heard something strange during the night, I shouldn't be afraid. I laughed and asked her what she meant by something strange, but she didn't give details and told me to try to ignore anything that happened, that they couldn't really do anything to me. We arrived and I helped her get down. I put her to bed and went to my room with those branches in my hand. They smelled like something bitter that I haven't been able to recognize to this day. But I listened to her. I placed them right on the nightstand and closed the door. I don't know if my grandmother Marina knew what was going to happen that night, but the truth is that I didn't sleep peacefully. As soon as I closed my eyes, I dreamed that someone was moving my bed. And I say dreamed because the feeling was that whenever I closed my eyes, strange things happened around me. But when I opened them, suddenly everything was normal. For a while I managed to sleep continuously, but suddenly my sleep was interrupted by the presence of a woman in the room. In this new nightmare, the woman, who was wearing a black dress with white dots, cried with all her strength. And although I couldn't see her face clearly, I could feel that she was young and desperate. At that moment, I woke up overwhelmed and looked around, but there was no one in the room. What I did feel was that the branches were giving off a much stronger smell. I tried to fall asleep again, and after a while the dream repeated, with the same woman crying. And this time, between the sobs, I clearly heard her tell me to please tell my grandmother to let her go, to stop using her, to let her go. I woke up with a dry throat, but this time I could still hear the crying in my ears, even though I couldn't see her anywhere in the room. That's when I knew that I wasn't dreaming, or at least not completely. I got out of bed, and in the kitchen my grandmother was handling some bones, small fragments of bone. She looked at me fixedly and just told me to go back. And although I would have liked to go against her, I did so. I went back to bed, and during the rest of the night, or at least for another 2 hours, I heard that woman crying in my dreams, or my grandmother outside doing God knows what kind of witchcraft work. Most likely it had been requested by that girl who arrived in the afternoon, but knowing what she had asked for was impossible, and that poor soul began to beg over and over again to be released. The only thing I could do was pray for her, and as soon as I finished the first prayer, my grandmother Marina knocked firmly on the door and told me that I should not do that night. How did she know? I will never know. At last, the ritual stopped, and I fell asleep again. Now in the dreams, the woman was quiet. They were tense nightmares, but I was no longer waking up terrified. The next morning, my grandmother Marina told me not to get involved in her affairs, and that if possible, I should not judge her like the rest of the family, because she had not invented evil, nor envy, nor ambition. She only gave people what they asked for, nothing more. I told her that it was fine, because of course I was not going to argue with her, and we changed the subject. During the following 2 weeks, I had nightmares and strange dreams, not only with that woman of whom I am sure my grandmother used her bones for some strange ritual, but I also dreamed of the Black Rooster Market, as she called it, with all the objects that were there. When my grandmother Marina finally recovered, I said goodbye to her and returned to Mexico City. It is very difficult for me to define that experience with a single word, but I think the closest would be terrifying. During that month, I discovered that there are forces that, no matter how much one ignores them, work in favor of selfish and ill-intentioned people, and that there are souls trapped in sinister deals, that there are people who trade in very dark things in markets set up in an improvised way, and that even if one sees only a few merchants, the souls that are there are many more.